Hi, this is one of the MSc students from York is online. So thank you for joining us.
Hi,
Um,
Helen. Hi, Bridget. How are you guys?
Hi.
yes, good to see you. So it's now recording. So if you'd like to share the slides.
Yes, indeed. Just hello, everyone. Um, okay. I seem to have lost my view.
All right, take your time.
Um, no, excuse me.
Oh, lovely picture of
No.
somewhere in
So
Sweden.
no, this is Kinsale in Ireland,
Oh, can
where
say
where the Phelan Barry, the primary author, the first author,
right,
was based.
right,
Uh,
lovely place.
Yes, indeed. Very nice and worth a visit if it
Yes.
just where the Spanish invaded Ireland once upon
All
a time.
right. Yeah.
So there's quite a European influence around there. But today I'm going to talk about global virtual team working during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I've been based at Karlstad University in Sweden, and I work to do some work for Dublin City University, where Phelan Barry was based. So I'm going to talk about virtual work a little, and this is about virtual work and versus face-to-face or on-site work. We're going to talk about team performance and the development are linked to communication and collaboration. We're going to talk about global teamwork and indeed virtual global teamwork. This study was conducted just over a year after the start of the COVID pandemic. There was the mandatory stay-at-home policy in place throughout a lot of the world, and the particular challenges became apparent for our global virtual team that we studied. And but we found that individuals were adapting well to the new situation and being quite proactive. So yeah, so there was the COVID-19 pandemic, which brought its own challenges and opportunities. It gave us the opportunity to do this research and investigate how global virtual teams were working. And the study was conducted with a multinational software development company that already had a global teamwork tradition in place. So they were used to virtual work. And then the pandemic came along, which made it even worse for them. The data we use are all real world data that were gathered in early 2021. So again, just a little more about the background. There were restrictions imposed, so people had no choice but to stay at home. Now, as I said, this company already had virtual global team in place. So you'd imagine it wouldn't be such a big deal. But the fact that the travel restrictions were imposed it did cause bother, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. There were no informal water cooler conversations, which hadn't really been noticed so much before the pandemic, even with this global virtual team. They found that creating relationships was taking longer, generating trust was difficult, sharing information was difficult enough too, and there were issues around trust and cooperation. I'll talk more about all this in a moment. So we're talking really about having virtual working plus the global reality, the global aspect of people working across the globe. And it's well recognized in our research and in others' research, indeed before us, that there's more formality in virtual work, which is something to keep in mind. So our research questions were, what are the main communication challenges that a global virtual team encounters? And can teams build cohesion when interactions are completely virtual? So again, our context was a large multinational software company with over 30,000 employees, and the locations span the globe. The focus on this study was on the project management organization, which had about 60 staff. There were product managers, business analysts, program and project managers, subject matter experts, and admin staff throughout, say, a global virtual team. And we got our team across multiple global locations. So pre-COVID, there were some centralized activities. There were kick-off meetings. So this company worked, we said they were project-based. They would have a kick-off meeting with people from around the globe coming to one location. And there were then some co-located work spurts, if you like, defined in a global setting where people would travel to maybe for a day or a couple of days at a time in the course of a long project. But in spring 2020, the working from home was imposed, so our data comes a year after that. Our methodology, we did the survey with the project manager organisation of 60 staff. We had two sections. The first focused on project management and the work-related communications. Section 2 focused on teamwork and team communications. The results of the survey prompted some interviews, and there were 5 interviews conducted. Only 5 because by the 5th, we weren't getting any new data. The same issues were just recurring. We had full ethical approval from the university and also permission from the company for the study, though we promised anonymity for the name of the company. The company, as it happens, has now been sold to a larger multinational, so it probably doesn't matter so much anymore. But anyway, they were a well-known multinational software development company. Our results, we had a 47% response rate, 57% male, 39% female, which wasn't so bad. The age group, most were over 25 years of age. We had 10% were under 25. And 43% spent 2/3 of their time in virtual work. 11% were between 1/3 and 2/3 of their time in virtual work. And I have it graphically in this pie chart here. So quite a significant amount of time, we say, for almost a half of the group, 43%, more than 2/3 of their time was spent in global virtual team activities. Our results. So the communication is extremely or very important to project success for everybody. Everybody agreed that this is key. Knowledge that your message is received and understood. Again, nobody disagreed with that. Everybody was in full agreement. That communication is more difficult in a virtual environment was agreed by 42%. And it was generally agreed that knowledge gathering is more difficult than knowledge sharing. And I have the detailed results here. This is our results on the modes of communication that were preferred, were considered most effective and most used in this chart here in the table. So we see, say, for the most effective, people felt that 36% felt that video call was the most effective means of communication. And next to that came voice calls, with 21% identifying that as most effective. The preferred communication was, there wasn't a lot of difference, 21% for voice, video, and face-to-face, 25% preferred email, with a smaller percentage with text or instant message. However, the most used means of communication was different, and email seemed to be the most predominantly used method of communication for the teams, with text messaging next. So as you can see, those were not preferred. Interestingly, there was no gender difference in the preference for the communication mode. But when it came to the most used form of communication, we found that women use more voice calls than men, even though they didn't particularly prefer them by any means, and they didn't even use them more. But they weren't the most used form of communication, but women tended to be on the phone more. And we don't know the reason why. So on more on communications and methods, lots of people said that virtual projects can be run just as effectively as face-to-face. In fact, overall, 46% of the people agreed that the projects were just as effective run virtually. However, for those people who spent more than 2/3 of their time in a global virtual team, they reckoned they were not as effective. So that virtual projects are not as effective as face-to-face projects. So this again could be something that people might investigate further. In terms of our results in relation to relationships and teamwork, it was generally felt that trust is more important than building relationships to get the work done, that is. And building trust is considered extremely or very important by 97%. And it's somewhat difficult or extremely difficult to build by 39%. Now, building relationships has a lesser important, but is still extremely or very important by almost 90%. And strong relationships are extremely or somewhat difficult to build by 61%. So that gives you an idea of I suppose, the distinction we're building between trust and relationships. They're linked, they go hand in hand, but to get the work done, you don't really need a relationship, is what we interpret from these data. So the actual figures are in this table here, table 2, and they're discussed more, of course, in the paper. But you'll see there that the importance of building trust and relationships, it comes up very high and very important to extremely important on the right-hand side. And the difficulty then is also high, but it's not so bad. Looking at the global virtual teams, most important characteristics are interesting, and we see that open communications is top of the list, and coming joint next with active participation and trust. And then defined roles really help, and mutual respect is a key feature, as well as having common goals. Accountability is down the list. Diversity and other are down too. But the most important things are open communication, active participation, and trust. They stand out as being coming up all the time for us. In relation to relationship and teamwork, the 3 most serious challenges are time zones, as you might expect. The lack of personal connection came up very high as well as communication failures. Now, table 4 gives the full list. We see communication failures there at 61% frequency. And we see cultural differences, for example, and technology down towards the bottom of the list at 11 and 14% respectively. So building a cohesive team, resolving conflict, and creating a healthy, that should be, culture are really important for relationships and teamwork, and are considered the 3 most difficult activities for global virtual teams. And I guess, we'll talk some more about that. This is depicted, the full result is in table 5. And we see how building the cohesive team, resolving conflict, and creating a healthy culture, I've starred there with red because they're considered extremely difficult or somewhat difficult by the majority of people. And oddly, you might think, or it's counterintuitive in a way to think that reaching agreements is extremely easy. And that's interesting because it gels with some other research that's done about less inhibition online. So that is another strand I'd like to encourage people listening to this video to think about doing some more research in. Why is it easier to reach agreement in online? We don't have an answer to that, but we can see the data is pretty clear. In terms of being creative, we have mixed results. So for some, they would say it's very difficult, and for some, extremely easy, which may be accounted by individual differences. We don't know. So as I say, we did interviews as well, and technology came up in all but one, all 4 out of 5 interviews. Technology was discussed, and the importance of the suitability of the software for the tasks at hand was stressed. They all agreed, and it was emphasized, that technology mediated communication is not the ideal way to communicate. Video calls are not always appropriate, for example, if active participation is required or if there are large settings of people. Having cameras on does help. And it was also emphasized during the interviews that we must acknowledge individual differences and that people have varying communication styles, which makes sense. And we know that intuitively, but sometimes we're inclined to forget it. With regard to the interview as well, trust and relationships go hand in hand, is one of the things that was emphasized and brought up time and time again. And people pointed out that the social aspect of co-located work is really important, and it's really missed by the global virtual teams. And it's regarded, like, particularly with hindsight and the experience of the pandemic, that the project startup meetings were really important in getting the project running effectively. But staff did adapt the new situation and can work effectively. I have that in inverted commas because people would say that it was effective for the time that was in it, but maybe not as effective as it could potentially be in a better non-pandemic situation, let's say. Now, interestingly, we have some data on knowledge gathering and knowledge sharing. It's more difficult for global virtual teams, and knowledge gathering is more difficult than knowledge sharing. And our data show that quite clearly as well. So the points for discussion, the obvious things are time zones and cultural differences. Time zones, it's very real, and I think we all have some experience of that if you're using Zoom at all. The cultural differences that you might have thought were a big obstacle aren't such a big deal. It's more important to have a more personal connection, and the lack of personal connection is a significant challenge for virtual teams and global virtual teams. Communication failure is a particular challenge, and especially given the reliance on technology. But the lack of informal water cooler moments, that has been raised over and over with us, that it's very hard to measure the value of the moments when might seem to be downtime, taking a coffee break with a colleague or going for a walk during your lunch break can have benefits that aren't so measurable. Building a cohesive team is really important, and trust and relationships are critical to virtual work and for global virtual teams especially, given their nature. Conflict is very interesting because it's difficult to recognize, and we write about this more in the paper. Conflict can percolate away under the surface, and you mightn't recognize it until it's, very difficult to resolve. And even when you do recognize it, even if it's early, it's difficult to resolve conflict in a virtual environment. So again, there's loads of potential research threads that can be picked up and developed here from our results. Defined roles certainly help in virtual teamwork, in all teamwork indeed, and virtual global teamwork, no less than anything else. So in conclusion, we've endorsed the reality that teamwork is what we have in our workplaces today. It's a reality in most workplaces. Virtual teamwork is difficult, despite the research that's been done on and distance matters, and we've been working virtually for some time now. It's still difficult, and I don't think we fully understand what our challenges even are. Global virtual teamwork makes it more difficult. Again, the time zones is one of the greatest challenges there, and the technology. But a healthy culture is really important, regardless of all the other things, and trust is critical for the job to get done. There may be gender differences. Our sample was small, relatively small, so we would guess that doing more studies, we might pick up gender differences. Whether these are important or not remains to be seen. It may be that some women are maybe better communicators than some of the males. Certainly, there'll be a perception in this part of the world that that may be the case, but it may not be true throughout. But certainly further research is needed, I would suggest, particularly with regard to gender and the ease of reaching agreements, as well as issues of conflict and conflict resolution. I've raced through our paper. I don't have really more to add. There's a long list of references in our paper, but I would point to these as some key ones. I want to thank you for your attention and invite some questions and leave you with some more pictures of Kinsale.
That's great, Bridget. Thank you very much. Very interesting, and even if it was a slightly short talk, that's absolutely fine. So one of the things I'm interested in is, given that this company was doing virtual global teamwork before the pandemic, did they have a sense of how the pandemic had made it harder? Were people more stressed and more worried because of the pandemic? Did that come up at all?
Yes, it did. They missed they traditionally had kickoff meetings
Right,
at the
yes.
start of a project, and they really missed those, and they missed the informality, the informal moments of the times when they would be co-located. And
Right.
it was suggested to me that the co-located work gave them the chance to build those trust and relationships that made the work run smoother online afterwards.
Yeah. And did they have ideas, given that when you did the research a year into the pandemic, no one was quite sure how long it was going to last? So did they have ideas of how they could create equivalents of that informality to build trust and develop teams? Because I think this is an ongoing problem, even though the pandemic's officially over. I think we see much more virtual work, and we see companies saying, oh, everyone must come back to the office. And people don't really want that, as far as I can tell.
They're mixed, yes. Certainly for some people, the benefits of being located where they want to be kind of were a trade-off for
Yeah.
the dealing with the virtual environment. But the company did try different. It was recognized that they missed the building the relationships and building some trust. I thought it was interesting that people felt it was more important to be able to trust your colleagues and have a relationship with them, which makes some sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
But in terms of even trying to build trust or building a healthy culture within the teams, the company did try several initiatives like having quiz nights online and having
Oh,
kind of
yes.
social virtual coffees and stuff. And none of, they kept trying different things out, but they hadn't actually found any solution by the time we were doing our research.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
most interesting, because I think that's a key thing we need to solve. And for example, in my department, well, you're probably familiar with, it's a big computer science department, about 250 people working there. And the computer scientists tend to be quite introverted, shall we say. So we used to have staff meetings before pandemic, which were not very successful. Not many people would come and there wouldn't be much interaction. And then a couple of years before the pandemic, we started having cake, tea, basically, afternoon tea, and we would provide cake, and that was quite successful. But when the pandemic hit, we started having a half-hour meeting every week. And I think that has been tremendously successful for solving part of this problem, in that people have a much better sense of what's going on in the department, and people can just share little snippets of information or ask for help. And we have, even now, they're hybrid, but we tend to have about 100 people any particular week. But it's still not that by the water cooler moment, as you
Yeah.
used the phrase, that's still lacking.
Yeah, it's very difficult to construct an informal activity online
Yes.
because there is a formality that's forced on one.
Yes.
And
Yes.
yeah.
And I remember during the pandemic, if I needed to ask one of my colleagues something, I'd have to email them and say, when are you free? I just need to ask you about something. And to put it in email was not appropriate. Maybe it was confidential, or it was just, it felt like too much faff. But then the faff of setting up a Zoom meeting, which I knew these people, so it was fine when we finally got together, but the effort of doing it. And I wonder whether, the company you studied, did they use anything like Slack or Discord, these always on communication channels?
Now I know they tried out different things. I wish my colleague was here. I
Right.
wouldn't swear.
Right.
I can't answer that clearly.
Yeah, because I'd be interested. I think that would be a productive area of research, where the teams who use that kind of always on communication channel, so you can just send someone a message. Of course, you still have the time zone problem, that if I want to ask you something and I'm in Chicago and
Yeah.
you're in Ireland, there's still going to be a big asynchrony, and even worse if I'm in Australia and you're in Ireland.
Yeah.
So it doesn't solve everything, but people tell me who've worked in those teams with that is another little solution to the problem. So you should ask Phelan.
I heard a remark that they didn't like different applications, several different things to work with.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that was one of the comments.
Yes, yes.
And then that people had different preferences, and some were good done. But the text, they were asked questions about a text and instant messages, and they were down at the bottom of the list
Right.
of preferred methods, actually, if I remember. It's there in one of the tables.
Yes, yes, yes.
But yeah, but the vocal, I noticed the visual and vocal were highest.
And I think it was particularly interesting, you're finding that women made more voice calls.
Yes, I was thinking about that, and I was wondering if it was that they were receiving more calls. We didn't check out that, but I suspect that maybe people were more inclined to phone a woman. I wonder. I wonder
Yes,
about that.
yeah, yeah. Because I was thinking about the fact that, and again, we're playing slightly into stereotypes here, but the received wisdom seems to be that women are still, I'll say, are still better at picking up non-verbal cues in communication. And you could, while voice isn't as good as face-to-face, it's better than text.
Yes, yes. And in the interviews, the issue about nonverbal cues came up, that they were lacking, and that you could yeah, that we still have some way to go with our technology.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. 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 And the cultural difference thing is interesting because, in fact, because my experience of virtual team working is mainly European projects. And the biggest cultural difference we ever had was working with a Dutch researcher. And my research assistant on that project would nearly be in tears regularly because this man was actually a really nice guy and he thought our work was really good. But every meeting he would come on and say, well, you've done this wrong and you haven't done this and you haven't done this. And then after about 10 minutes of completely destructive rant, he'd say, and it's really good. And that's the Dutch style of being very direct. And
Yeah.
the Swedes are a little bit similar.
I noticed a comment in the
Oh
chat.
yes, please, yes,
uh,
I'm rabbiting
Yeah,
on.
no, it's just that adding to what you said, in fact, that
Yes,
Slack and Discord are a
yes,
bit informal and a fun way to communicate this person rights as opposed to
yes,
emails, and also preferred by many. And again, I would say that what came up is that there are different preferences and different styles that need to be taken into account, really, and that's
yes.
part of the, I suppose, difficulty in designing technology, that different people want to communicate different ways, or different preferences.
And I
So,
think the other thing, oh yes, sorry, Karina, do go ahead.
yeah, yeah. So, I'd like to add a bit to that.
Yep,
Having worked
please do.
at like a product development company, which was fairly small, not nearly as huge as the one that you researched with. But what we do is the things that needed to be formal and on emails that needed like that were about approvals and things like that, they would be on email. But when talking to teammates about how the process is going, about okay, how are you going with this particular aspect of the product development thing? And between teammates, they would always prefer Slack or Discord over emails. Like that would be if someone would want to ask, are you available for a quick chat or something? They would
Yep.
prefer Slack, and so that's generally how we do things around them. So I think, yeah, I found it quite funny, when you said that you'd have to ask an a coworker if they were free, or you'd have to email them asking, are you
Yes,
free around this time? Then set up the meeting, then all of the stuff. And that was, I know how that was. And I think that was really, sometimes I feel that's really unnecessary, especially knowing that you know that person, and you've been acquaintances and things like that. So that's quite funny that we have to go
yep.
follow like such a tedious process for things like that.
I think the problem was that, well, there are two aspects of the problem. One more to do with the technology and one to do with the COVID situation. So, and maybe there's a kind of generational issue here or how you've worked, that before COVID, I had never used Slack or Discord. And I think many of the academics in the department were the same. So it took us a while to understand how to use, we had Slack for the
Mm-hmm.
staff at the university. It took us a while to understand how we could use that most effectively. And because we went into it just boom in COVID, we had no training or introduction. So, but the other thing was people were in online meetings for hours during COVID. There was so much planning and teaching and recording your lectures. So you needed to find out when someone was free, because often just weren't free. They were on Zoom meetings 8, 9 hours a day. And that's why I asked Bridget at the beginning, whether the company was aware of stress affecting the situation, because everybody was so stressed and so busy that it was hard to get in touch with people, even though you knew you only wanted to ask them a 2-minute thing, what should I do about this assessment? How are we going to do it? Type of thing. So, but I think the idea that what we need is an integrated working environment like a VLE for education, where you can swap between voice call, video call, text, leave each other messages, have a workspace. I think that's what's needed, and we don't have it yet, but we're moving towards it. And research like Bridget's research is very helpful in guiding how that can work best.
Right.
But you
Yeah.
young people, you see, you're so used to Slack and Discord. That's more natural. Whereas for me, sending someone an email is more natural.
Mm.
Yeah,
The
correct.
other thing I thought was that I think there's a difference between people who are occasionally online or doing work
Yes.
on that and the ones who are there. Like I experienced those 8-10 hour days online
Yes.
as well. And, you know, it's not sustainable.
No, it's a,
You can
and
do
I
it for a
think,
short term.
yeah.
Yeah.
And the fact that we were doing it, those long hours on Zoom, and then we were so stressed by the situation and what was, I mean, I think people have underestimated how much stress COVID caused people in both their personal lives, but also their work lives. How is this going to work? How long is it going to be
Yeah.
for? Are we just all gonna, I remember I had one friend and he's a world-leading AI expert, he's not a stupid guy. He was convinced we were all going to die. And I would spend about an hour a week on Zoom with him saying, I don't think so, Tom. I think we're going to come through this. I'm not sure. I think it's really important research, because I think COVID has kind of changed the game, and there is in more and more remote team working. So we need to make it not only as effective as possible, but as comfortable for people as possible.
Yes.
So,
yeah. There's a lot a lot more research to be done. I think it's hit on, we've jumped ahead in using the technology and working remotely without really understanding all about it, I think, yet,
yes.
and
Yeah.
the impact it's having.
Yes,
Yeah, I
definitely.
mean, there's good and and I don't think it's one solution fits all. I think maybe different types of work might be easier or not so easy.
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting that you said the company had tried things like, quiz nights, and that hadn't worked, because I was in one project. Now, we had met just before COVID, but most of the project was conducted during COVID. And we ended up having a conference, and we had about 100 people, and that was probably one of the first online big events that many people went to. And to my amazement, we had planned for a face-to-face conference with 40 people, and we ended up having an online conference with 110 people. And so we included a conference dinner, an online conference dinner, and a quiz. And I felt they worked very well. But perhaps that was because it wasn't work per se. It was an academic conference, and it was during lockdown, so people were just desperate for some connection with people. But I thought, oh, this actually, I mean, obviously the conference dinner was very different. What we did was we told people everyone should cook their dinner, and then tell people, if possible, cook something that was related to your national dish or something you liked, and then you got to tell people what you were eating and what it was and why it was important to you, and that worked very nicely. So
Interesting. Yeah,
one of my
personal connection and the lack of personal connection did
yes.
come up, and I think we've referred to it in the paper.
Yes, I think yes, and I think that that's really important in building trust. And also I mean, I thought it was really interesting that you said cultural differences were less important, and it's personal, because I think when you have informal communication connection with people, then you understand, oh, well, as I did with this Dutch researcher, he is actually a good person and he is well disposed to us, but this is just his nature to be very brutal in the way he described things. And yeah, because in fact we had a lot of meetings before I met him, and when I met him, I thought my view of him flipped, that, oh yeah, he's a good guy, he's just Dutch. Yes. And the Swedes can be a little bit like that, not quite as brutal as the Dutch.
Yeah, the Danes too can be quite direct.
Yeah, oh yes, the
Yeah,
Danes are very,
yeah.
yes, more so than the Dutch, yes, yeah. So Trina, coming from India, have you found cultural differences that you didn't expect coming to study in the UK?
I would say nothing that I did not expect.
Right.
And moreover, my experience has been very mixed because although I may come from India, but I have seen that I have been acquainted with like a lot of Mexicans, a lot of Chinese, a lot of other South Asians, and it's just become like a very huge mix of different cultures to the point where now I wouldn't assume anything. I'd be
Right.
more open. I would not expect, I wouldn't have certain expectations in a certain way. But although one cultural difference I did very much think was um very obvious was the drinking culture here in Britain.
Yes, yes,
Because and it's really interesting that one can buy alcohol from supermarkets and stuff like that, but back home uh it's kind of not very sought after situation to be going to a shop that sells alcohol. You don't want people to see you like buying alcohol, let
yes,
alone seeing you drunk. So it's a very hush hush thing, especially for girls. Like
yes,
none of the girls would want to be caught dead at the alcohol shop trying to buy alcohol. So I think that's the drinking culture. I think that is one that stood out the most. But
yes, yeah,
yeah, otherwise it has been a very fun experience, and in a way also welcomed the differences, because in the very reason that I came to the UK was to actually be exposed to different cultures, and especially that is best found in universities because
mm,
a lot of different people come from different places.
yeah,
So
yeah. Now, if you
yeah.
went to Sweden, where Bridget's been living, there's a very different drinking culture, but I remember being very shocked when I went to buy a bottle of wine on a Saturday lunchtime and found you can't do that in Sweden.
Whoa, you can't. I think
No,
is it so then there are certain specific times you
It's
shouldn't.
it's government controlled. There are government shops where you buy alcohol, and it closes early on a Saturday, and it's not open on a Sunday or in evenings.
yes,
Um,
Oh,
mm,
yeah, that's quite a shock.
yeah,
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's similar in Norway.
yes,
Oh,
which
yeah.
doesn't stop people drink. I mean, I think it's an attempt to control, because they do have an alcohol problem in Scandinavia, and it's an attempt to be stricter, but I don't think it stops. But you don't, certainly where I lived in Sweden, you didn't see anything like the public drunkenness that you see now in Britain.
Hmm.
But
Right.
they do, particularly there's a big drinking problem for men in Scandinavia. So
Mm.
Hmm. Hmm, hmm.
Well, Bridget, we had
Yeah.
a couple of people who joined, but they've already left. So I'm sorry you didn't have a big live audience, but it was an excellent talk, and we will put it online. I'll send you the link when we put it
Okay.
online. You can publicize it. So thank you very much, and keep
Thank
up the
you.
research because it's really important. and
Thank
really
you.
interesting. And we would welcome further papers at interacting with computers. So
So nice to see you both, and have a nice Christmas break.
yes, we will
And
do. Yes,
new year ahead.
yes.
Thank you, Bridget. This
Okay,
was very
thank you very much.
interesting.
Very happy Christmas and all the best for 2024 to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank
Many
you.
happy returns. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.